Okay, this is Lesson Notes 9.5. This is Lesson Notes over quadratic equations and the quadratic formula. But before we get to that, we're going to practice a little bit with the transformation formulas. Make sure you know this. So pause the video if you would and try to do numbers 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so for number 1, you should have gotten a transformation of up 5 because you're going from a -1 up to a +4. Number 2, you should have gotten that this was a compression or a shrink. The reason why is we're going from this graph with a bigger number to the smaller number. So that means 3x would be the taller, skinnier one, and then you'd go down to a 2x, which is like that. So the smaller the number, the wider it gets. Number 3, the answer to this one, you should have gotten D. So here's our objective today, to solve quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula and use the discriminant. It's part of the quadratic formula. So if you would, go play the video links that I sent you with the quadratic formula song. Those will help you remember this and understand what's going on with this. So the quadratic formula looks like this. It's got a -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The a, b, and c come from the standard form, so don't forget that this is standard form. And in the standard form, a is the number in front of the x squared, b is the number in front of the x, and c is not only the y-intercept of a parabola, but it also is the constant. Oh, and a can't be 0, because if a was 0, this wouldn't be a quadratic formula. That x squared term would be gone. So we're going to solve this by the quadratic formula. You have to put it in standard form. So standard form of this is x squared minus 2x minus 35 equals 0. From here we pick out our a, b, and c. There's not a number in front of the x squared, so you put a 1. So a equals 1, b equals -2, c equals -35. So I'm going to draw a fraction bar. I'm going to put the plus and minus here, put the square root right there, and under here I'm going to put 2. And inside this parentheses, that's where the b was, because the formula again is -b plus or minus the square root of, and I put parentheses in here, b squared minus 4ac. So you're going to want to use parentheses on the b, because if you have a negative, it makes it a lot easier. So the x value, we could solve this by factoring and figure out x, just like we've done before, but this is probably going to be a prime one. So this is great for finding the solutions to prime or decimal version solutions, where there really is a 0, but it's a decimal. Everything we've done to this point has always been about factoring, and those involve integers. So for this one, x equals negative. Instead of that b, I'm going to put in a -2. Then plus or minus the square root of -2 squared minus 4. A is 1. Notice I put the a in a parentheses, and c is -35. What this does is it helps you remember that you're multiplying all of those first. Remember, if order of operations in PEMDAS, you're supposed to multiply everything first, take care of things under the square root sign. So, and this is over 2 times a. So a is 1 in this case. So to simplify this, the b becomes just 2. I'll explain the plus or minus in just a minute. We're going to simplify everything underneath the square root sign. Everything underneath the square root sign is called the discriminant. Step by step, it looks like this: 4. And then this, you have to do all of this multiplication together. So think of it as -4 times 1 times -35. So -2 squared was 4, and then we're multiplying all of that together. So that's 4 times a times c, which is positive 140 all over the 2. So I did this thing I did everything underneath here. Be careful and make sure you multiply all those numbers first. Don't do -4. Don't do 4 minus 4 because you'll end up with 0 and it won't work. You have to do the multiplication. A square root sign is just like having everything in parentheses. It's grouped together, so you have to do everything inside there first. So now from there, this becomes x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 144 all over 2. So this is what that plus or minus thing means. It's just a compact way for math people. The square root of 144 is 12, so I'm going to change this to 12. To write two problems in one, conserving space. So x equals 2 plus 12 over 2, but x also equals 2 minus 12 over 2. So we just took that and we separated it by the 2 plus or minus. It was 2 plus or minus 12 over 2. So we just rewrote that 2 times. One with the plus and one with the minus. So from here you use order of operations, 14 over 2, which equals 7. This is negative 10 over 2, which equals negative 5. So the solutions to this are the two zeros. X equals 7, x equals negative 5. Now I talked about doing this when you don't have whole numbers for your zeros or your x-intercepts, because that's what those are. So if I were to graph this parabola, when I graph it, it would have zeros at negative 5 and 7. And so for this one, would it be facing up or down? It's a positive A, so it would be facing up. So it would look something like this. Okay, this one had actual integers for the solution to it, only because it's your beginning one. Typically these are used for fractions and used for decimals, but I have used the quadratic formula to solve and factor when I haven't been able to think of what the two numbers are that multiply to be something or add to be something. Sometimes if it's a huge number, this is just way faster. Okay, so example 2. I want you to try this on your own. I'll help you out with the A, B, and C. A is the number in front of the 1, or in front of the x squared. B is the 1 in front of the x, and C. So pause the video. You try to fill this in, and then we'll come back and see how you did. Okay, let's check it out. Did you get x equals 5 and x equals negative 6? So again, what you're doing is you're using this formula. And then with that formula, you're plugging in your numbers, substituting everything in. Then simplify everything under the square root sign. In your calculator, if you go and you put 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 30 in like that, and then just have a calculator do it. Sometimes you can check your work. Of course, all the time you don't always have a calculator, but you can always check your work that way for that discriminant that's underneath the square root sign. Okay, and then don't forget that you've got to separate everything, simplify it as far as you can with that plus or minus in there. Then you simplify the plus into its own problem and the minus into its own problem. Everything else is identical. Then you simplify. Don't forget you have to do the top of the fraction bar first, and then you do the bottom. Here's another one. You can check your work with it and make sure that you can do this also. When you're done with this, I'll give you the answer, but pause the video and try it. Okay, hopefully you got to at least this point. Now I'd say use your calculator, and sometimes the book answers will be in calculator, but I want you to simplify the radicals. So remember this. The square root of 44 is the same thing as the square root of 4 times 11. Square root of 4 is 2, square root of 11 stays in the house. So this one turns out kind of funny because we have that root there. So here's what you do with this. 2 plus 2 square roots of 11 over 4. For this one, because we have a 2 in both those places and a 4 on the bottom, we can actually rewrite this as 2 over 4 plus 2 square roots of 11 over 4. which equals then 1/2 plus the square root of 11 over 2. Or we could write it as 1 plus the square root of 11 over 2. So that's typically the way we write it. We don't split up the denominator, but if you get the same denominator on both of those answers terms, then you can combine it into one. So that would be the exact answer. The reason why it's exact is because every decimal is in that square root of 11 and accounted for. As soon as you round it, you've lost the value of any decimals that you round off. So we'll do the same thing on this one. This is 2 minus 2 square roots of 11 over 4. So 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. And so I'm going to do this like this. Let me rewrite that so you can see it better. Move it to the right of this. So this is 1 minus the square root of 11 all over 2, because I'm dividing by 2 here, which means you have to divide each of those by 2, and you get 1 for each of those. If you don't understand what I did, then just follow this one down below, because that kind of breaks it up in the steps of what's happening. So the two solutions are this. So we can actually write the solution as x equals 1 plus or minus square root of 11, because everything is identical between those two answers except for the plus and the minus. This one does say to round to the nearest tenth if necessary. So if you're doing that at any point, you could go to a decimal. You could have used gone to your calculator here and put that in and then divide it by 4, or put that in and divide it by 4. The thing that's important in your calculator is you have to put 2 plus the square root of 44 together in the parentheses and then divide by 4. So for this one, it's negative 2.3. And for this one, oh, that's bad, sorry. This one is 2.15. Okay, so for this one, when you do this one, I want you to try it, pause it, and see if you can do this. You should get x equal 2, and x equals negative 2/5. I'm going to leave that one up to you to figure out, because there are different methods to solve this. So you're going to be expected to know how to do this by graphing. By graphing, you have to know how to graph the axis of symmetry, x equals negative b over 2a. You need to know how to do the vertex. Vertex is going to be the coordinate point negative b over 2a. And then the y value, when you plug in this value back into your equation. All of these you have to put it in standard form too, though, so make sure you do that first off. Because if you don't do that, you won't have the correct a, b, and c signs. Okay, then you would graph those 2 points and then graph a couple more by making a points table, the x and y value. When you do this by factoring, you're going to do the thing where you figure out, I'll do this one, 3x squared minus 5x minus 12 equals 0. You want to figure out what two numbers multiply to be negative 36 and add to be negative 5. So for this one, that would be positive 4 and negative 9. So this becomes 3x squared plus 4x minus 9x minus 12 equals 0. Then you do grouping. So grouping would be x times 3x plus 4 minus 3 times 3x plus 4 equals 0. So our two factors are 3x plus 4 times x minus 3 equals 0. So 3x plus 4 equals 0. X minus 3 equals 0. So x has to equal negative 4/3, and x has to equal 3. And then there's a quadratic formula that we just talked about. No matter which way you do this, you should get the same thing. So if we had done it with graphing, you would have had x-intercepts or zeros at these points as well. So zeros, x-intercepts, solutions all mean the same value. Quadratic formula, you're going to use x equals -5 plus or minus